You guys just keep asking for the more Reddit stories. So, I'm ready with the new tale. Let's read some cool, interesting cheating wife Reddit stories. And guys, I'm trying to hit 1,000 subs before the end of the year, and I think we can do it. So please subscribe and let's get straight into this one. My wife's open marriage fantasy led me to her sister. I remember when Rebecca first brought it up. We were in bed, post-date night, sipping wine and joking about the future. Out of nowhere, she sighed, turning to me with that glint in her eye, one I'd come to recognize as trouble. Have you ever thought about, I don't know, exploring with other people? She asked. At first, I laughed, thinking she was teasing. But her gaze didn't shift. She was dead serious. Rebecca was smart, confident, and in so many ways, my equal. We've been married for 6 years, both dedicated professionals in our fields, living the kind of life others envied. Sure, we had our ups and downs like any couple, but I thought we were solid, unbreakable. Yet, there she was, talking about freedom in marriage and exploring new experiences, ideas she described with the sort of eloquence only Rebecca could manage. It's not about replacing each other, she explained, her hand resting on mine. It's about expanding what we have. Don't you think a little freedom would bring us even closer? In any other conversation, I would have brushed off the suggestion, laughed it away. But something in her voice that night had an edge, almost daring me to react. So, I did what any husband would. I indulged her, listening as she laid out her version of a modern marriage. She painted it as a grand adventure, an evolution of our bond. Still, beneath my calm demeanor, a strange unease began to gnaw at me. I told her I'd think about it. That's when she leaned in close, her smile filled with the kind of mischief I hadn't seen in a long time. She murmured, "You won't regret it." I spent the next few days brooding over her words, weighing the kind of impact this would have on us. I wasn't naive. This was risky, no matter how Rebecca framed it. Trust was the bedrock of our relationship, and I'd seen plenty of men ruined by the very thing my wife was now suggesting. But maybe, just maybe, Rebecca was right. Perhaps letting each other roam would strengthen us. The first sign things weren't as innocent as she claimed came one night when she said she was meeting friends after work. Normally, she'd text updates, check in, or call to let me know she'd be late. That evening, though, her phone was suspiciously silent. By midnight, I was lying awake in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, telling myself I was being paranoid. But when she finally walked in, her cheeks flushed and hair tousled, I knew something was up. She mumbled an excuse about running into an old friend, avoided my gaze, and brushed past me into the shower. There was an uncomfortable silence hanging in the air, but I didn't press her that night. Days turned into weeks, and Rebecca's behavior grew bolder. She'd leave the house dressed to the nines, with no explanation. It was around this time I learned of Sebastian, a name that came up casually in conversation one night. I felt a pang in my chest hearing her talk about him, an old friend she'd reconnected with through a work event, she claimed. She laughed off my concerns, promising he was just someone interesting. But it was in her eyes, that glimmer of excitement. It was all there. One night, she left for dinner with the girls, but my gut told me otherwise. I knew this wasn't how she typically behaved, and the pieces weren't adding up. So, I waited a bit, then decided to follow her, needing to see for myself. I was hardly prepared for what I saw. My wife with a man, the way she'd used to look at me, lost in his gaze. They sat at a cozy booth in the dim corner of a jazz bar, sipping wine, her hand brushing his. I watched, numb and disbelieving. How had we come to this? She'd sold me this fantasy of open marriage, promising me freedom but seemingly keeping secrets of her own. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I waited until she was asleep and quietly stepped out onto our balcony, breathing in the cool night air, wondering how our marriage had twisted so dramatically in just a few weeks. She wanted freedom, and yet here I was, shackled by the realization that I was the only one playing by the rules she'd set. In the coming days, I played my part well. Rebecca had no clue I knew, and she continued on with her charade, even growing bolder. One afternoon, I found myself staring at a picture of her sister, Eve. Rebecca and Eve couldn't have been more different. Rebecca was bold and fearless, while Eve had a quiet strength about her, a calmness that had always grounded me. She was a soft place to land, and in that moment, the absurd thought hit me. If Rebecca wanted a free marriage, why shouldn't I enjoy it too? So I did something Rebecca would never expect. I called Eve, under the pretense of catching up, and invited her out for coffee. I had no plans, no real agenda. I just needed a tether, someone I could trust, even if only for a conversation. Eve showed up at the coffee shop, just as effortlessly radiant as I remembered. She'd always had that classic kind of beauty, understated but powerful, with warmth in her eyes that made you feel at ease. As she walked over to me, I felt a pang of guilt for involving her in this mess, even if she didn't know it yet. I managed to keep our conversation light at first, asking about work, her recent trip abroad, and how their parents were doing. We laughed about little things, swapping stories from childhood. Yet, despite my best efforts, there was an edge to our talk, a weight just beneath the surface, one I could tell she sensed. Finally, I let out a sigh, one I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I could feel Eve watching me closely. "I haven't seen you look this tired in a long time, Marcus," she said gently, leaning forward. "What's going on?" It took every ounce of willpower I had not to spill everything right then. I opened my mouth, closed it, then finally settled on, "Things are complicated between Rebecca and me." Her brow creased, and I could see the genuine concern in her eyes. "I'd noticed some distance between you two at the last family dinner, but I thought it was just a rough patch." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's more than a rough patch. She has been talking about having an open relationship." I forced a smile, hoping it hid the bitterness I felt. Eve looked at me, her lips parting slightly in shock. "Rebecca brought this up?" "Not just brought it up," I said, laughing bitterly. "She's been living it." For a long moment, we sat in silence. Eve's expression was one of shock mixed with a touch of sadness. "I can't believe she would do this to you, Marcus. You two have always been so," she trailed off, as if realizing the absurdity of finishing that sentence. "I know. I thought the same thing." I sighed, clenching my fists under the table to keep from breaking down. "She sold it as some way to keep us closer. But it's like she just wanted a ticket to. I don't know. It doesn't feel like us." Eve reached out, her hand gently covering mine, a silent reassurance that I didn't have to carry this alone. And as her fingers lingered, warmth flooded over me, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in months. The simple comfort of her touch felt like a lifeline, and in that moment, a surge of something different stirred inside me. In the days that followed, Eve and I continued to stay in touch. She checked in on me, sometimes with a quick text, sometimes a late-night phone call. Somehow, she managed to keep me steady without needing details. I didn't tell her everything. Just knowing she was there, a steadying force, was enough. Meanwhile, Rebecca became more unpredictable. She'd vanish for hours at a time, saying she was running errands or out with friends. Then she'd come back home and barely look at me, lost in her own world. She started getting dressed up more often, too, pulling out outfits I hadn't seen her wear in years, spending longer in front of the mirror, and leaving the house with barely a word. Her free marriage fantasy was more about her freedom than ours, and I was supposed to just smile and support her. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated. Seeing how much time I spent talking to Eve, how much I'd come to depend on her steady presence, even if Rebecca didn't know why. She started getting jealous. She'd make snide remarks like, "Didn't know you and Eve were best friends now," or "Glad someone's taking care of you while I'm out." It was almost laughable, the irony of her wanting everything for herself while denying me any comfort from someone who had been family long before Rebecca's Sebastian ever appeared in our lives. Then came the night that changed everything. I was at home, cooking dinner when Rebecca came in, looking both surprised and a little off-balance to find me there. She stood in the doorway, her gaze sweeping over me as if trying to gauge my mood. "Cooking for yourself now?" she asked, her tone snide. "Just thought I'd make dinner tonight," I replied casually, not letting her attitude bother me. I'd grown too numb to feel much else. She crossed the kitchen, grabbing a glass of wine and leaning against the counter. I noticed she'd spent a lot of time on her hair, on her makeup, and her dress was far more daring than anything she wore at home. But something about the scene felt odd, staged even. There was an edge to her as she sipped her wine, almost as if she was waiting for a reaction from me. Finally, she set the glass down and looked at me. "So, how are things with you and Eve?" I glanced up, surprised. "What's that supposed to mean?" She shrugged, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "You've been spending so much time with her. You think I don't notice?" I held her gaze, more frustrated than amused by her hypocrisy. "Isn't that what you wanted, Rebecca? For us to have freedom?" She narrowed her eyes, as if she hadn't expected me to turn her words against her. "There's a difference, Marcus. You're always talking about honesty, transparency. Are you really being honest with me?" Her words sent a surge of anger through me. "Honest? Coming from you. That's rich." I stepped closer, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You want honesty? Fine. I think you're hiding things, Rebecca. You're the one who's lying to my face every day. So, if you're so invested in honesty, maybe you should look in the mirror first." Her expression faltered for a split second, then hardened. She took a deep breath, composing herself. "I think we need to set some ground rules. If we're going to keep this open arrangement, there needs to be boundaries." Boundaries? I couldn't help but laugh, the irony cutting through the tension. "You're serious?" She nodded, a flicker of defensiveness in her eyes. "I don't like the idea of you and my sister. Keep things platonic." "I mean it, Marcus." Something in me snapped then. "You don't get to dictate the rules now, Rebecca. You gave up that right the moment you decided to keep secrets. If you want freedom, you don't get to control mine." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, a tiny crack in the confidence she'd been wielding like a weapon. But it was too late for regret. She'd set this chain of events in motion, and I was done playing by her rules. I turned away, focusing back on dinner, effectively ending the conversation. Rebecca stormed off, probably frustrated by her inability to control the situation. But something inside me felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. I'd let go of trying to please her, and for the first time in a long while, I felt free. As the days passed, my bond with Eve grew deeper, more complicated. I wasn't sure if she felt it too, but there were moments, a lingering look, a brush of our hands, that hinted at something unspoken, something powerful. One evening, we met at a quiet park. I texted her, asking if she wanted to go for a walk, just to escape for a while. She agreed immediately, and when I saw her standing by the fountain, her face lit up in a gentle smile. It felt like coming home. I didn't know if I'd ever tell her everything, but just being near her was enough. At one point, as we strolled along the path, our hands accidentally touched. I felt a jolt of electricity, and I noticed her eyes widen slightly before she looked away, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. In that brief moment, I knew. I wasn't alone in feeling this connection, but I wasn't going to rush it, not when the stakes were this high. Instead, I focused on enjoying her presence, on savoring the peace she brought to my life. The tension with Rebecca had been brewing ever since our argument in the kitchen, but neither of us brought it up again. We fell into an unspoken truce, each pretending that everything was fine, though the cracks between us were undeniable. She continued her late nights and catch-ups with friends, and I kept my conversations with Eve going, though now there was a different energy between us, a charge I hadn't expected. One night, when Rebecca announced she'd be going out again, I decided to reach out to Eve. I couldn't resist it any longer. I needed the grounding she gave me, the calmness that felt like my only escape from the chaos of my marriage. We met up at a cozy wine bar she suggested, a quiet place tucked into a corner of the city. From the moment I saw her, I could feel the warmth radiating from her, a steady reassurance I'd come to crave. Eve looked stunning that night. She dressed simply, but her soft curls framed her face in a way that made her beauty seem effortless. We exchanged pleasantries, but beneath the light conversation, something simmered, something both of us seemed to feel yet didn't dare name. Over the next hour, the wine and laughter softened the edges of the evening. We swapped stories, shared jokes, and for a while, I forgot everything. The lies, the secrecy, Rebecca's betrayals. I felt lighter, freer than I had in months. Finally, after a pause, Eve sighed, her eyes searching mine. Marcus, what are you going to do? She asked softly, her hand resting gently on the table between us. What do you mean? With Rebecca, you can't go on like this. It's tearing you apart. I looked away, the reality of her words hitting me hard. I wanted to answer, to tell her exactly how I felt, but the truth was, I didn't know what I wanted anymore. All I knew was that the life I'd envisioned with Rebecca was gone, replaced by something I couldn't recognize. I don't know, I replied finally, my voice barely a whisper. I can't see a way out of this that doesn't end in something ugly. Eve's hand covered mine then, her touch sending a jolt through me. She looked at me with such empathy, such understanding, that I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to pull her close, to feel the safety she offered, but I couldn't let myself cross that line. Not yet. Marcus, you don't have to decide everything tonight, she said softly. But whatever you do, just make sure it's for the right reasons. Don't let her drag you down. Her words were both comforting and painful, striking the exact point of my inner conflict. I nodded, unable to reply, and squeezed her hand in silent gratitude. We stayed like that for a moment longer, neither of us saying a word, just existing in each other's presence. And in that silence, I felt a connection stronger than anything I'd felt in years. That night, when I got home, Rebecca was already asleep. I stared at her from the doorway, watching the rise and fall of her breath, the calm expression on her face. She looked so peaceful, as if she didn't have a care in the world, as if everything between us was perfectly fine. It made my blood boil. The next morning, I confronted her, unable to keep my resentment at bay. Who were you with last night? I asked, my voice sharp. She glanced up from her coffee, barely fazed. What's with the interrogation, Marcus? Answer me, I demanded, my tone cold. She rolled her eyes, setting her mug down. Why does it matter? Isn't this what we agreed on? Freedom, remember? Freedom? I laughed bitterly. Freedom doesn't mean lying to my face every day. If that's what you think, then you're more deluded than I thought. For a split second, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by the familiar indifference. Why are you so uptight about this? You wanted freedom too, didn't you? Or does it only matter when it's me? I clenched my fists, holding back the urge to shout. This isn't freedom, Rebecca. This is deceit. You've been lying to me while pretending we're still in some open marriage, like I just accept this mess. She scoffed, her face a mask of defiance. Then leave, Marcus. If you can't handle it, leave. I'm done pretending for you. The words stung, cutting deeper than I'd expected. I knew our marriage was fractured, but hearing her say it so plainly felt like the final blow. The room was thick with tension, our silent standoff broken only when she walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. I sat there, numb, feeling the weight of our crumbling relationship pressing down on me. She'd just given me an ultimatum, and I knew she meant it. For her, this free marriage had been a way to check out of our life together without the burden of consequences. And I was done playing her game. Later that day, I reached out to Eve. I told her everything, not just about our most recent argument, but the betrayal, the lies, the feeling of being trapped in a marriage that was falling apart piece by piece. She listened patiently, never interrupting, only offering the occasional nod or a reassuring look. Marcus, she said after a pause, her voice calm but serious. You deserve more than this. More than living in Rebecca's shadow. You've spent so much time trying to keep the peace, to make things work, but sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away. Her words struck a nerve, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. She was right. For months, I'd been so focused on preserving whatever was left of my marriage that I hadn't considered what I wanted. What would bring me peace? I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the kindness, the strength that had been missing from my life. Without thinking, I reached out, covering her hand with mine, feeling a warmth that went beyond mere comfort. Thank you, Eve, I whispered, barely able to hold back the emotion in my voice. I don't think I could get through this without you. She smiled, her eyes softening, and in that moment, I knew. This connection between us was more than just a friendship. It was a lifeline, something that had grown quietly in the shadows of my marriage's collapse, something I could no longer deny. Before either of us could say anything more, I leaned forward, my heart pounding. For a split second, I hesitated, but then her lips met mine, soft and warm. A kiss that felt like home. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desperation. It was one of understanding, of two people who had been searching for something real and had finally found it. When we pulled back, Eve looked at me, her cheeks flushed, a mix of surprise and happiness in her eyes. We didn't need words. We both understood the depth of but as the reality set in, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. What are we going to do, Marcus? About all of this? I took her hand, squeezing it gently. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I do know that I can't keep living like this. I deserve a life that feels real, not one built on lies. She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. Then let's figure it out. Together. That night, I made a decision. I was done letting Rebecca dictate my life, done pretending that I could salvage something that had been broken beyond repair. I walked into our bedroom, packed a bag, and left without a word. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I drove away, a strange sense of freedom washed over me. The road stretched out before me, open and endless, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could finally breathe. After leaving the house that night, I checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town. The room was sparse, the bed lumpy, and the wallpaper had definitely seen better days, but I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of peace. The weight of Rebecca's lies and manipulation seemed to lift as soon as I closed the door. I was free, at least for the night, from the toxic hold she'd had on me. Eve was the first person I texted. I left, I wrote simply, my fingers trembling slightly as I hit send. I didn't know if she'd still be awake, but a few seconds later, my phone buzzed. Marcus, are you okay? Her message was brief, but I could feel her concern through the screen. Yeah, I replied. I'm okay. Just needed to get out of there. After a few moments, she replied. I'm here if you need me. Anytime. I read her message several times, her words giving me a calm I hadn't felt in ages. Knowing she was there, knowing she understood. It made everything feel just a little bit less overwhelming. The next morning, I woke up to the harsh sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. I barely slept, my mind racing with the events of the past few weeks, the realization of all the things I'd been blind to, willingly or not. But when I thought of Eve, the night we'd shared in silence and understanding, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in months, hope. I decided to call Rebecca. I needed to make things clear, to finally confront everything we'd been avoiding. Her phone rang a few times before she picked up, her voice groggy. Marcus, she mumbled. Where are you? I left, I replied, my tone firm but calm. I think it's time we both face the truth about where this is heading. She didn't respond right away, and for a moment, I thought she might just hang up. But then she let out a sigh, a sound heavy with frustration. So, that's it? You're just done? I didn't make this decision overnight, Rebecca. I gave you chance after chance to be honest with me, to tell me the truth. But every time, you chose yourself. I paused, the silence between us thick with the weight of everything left unsaid. You wanted freedom, and now you've got it. She let out a bitter laugh. Freedom? Is that what you think I wanted? Maybe I just wanted a husband who didn't cling to every stupid ideal we set when we were kids, Marcus. People grow. They change. So, this is my fault? I asked, incredulous. I'm the one who forced you to lie, to cheat? Her silence told me everything. Rebecca had crossed lines I couldn't forgive, and now, she couldn't even own up to her choices. Part of me felt a pang of sadness, a reminder of the woman I'd loved once. But that woman was long gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I'm not coming back, I said finally. I'll get in touch with a lawyer. We'll figure this out. There was a long pause, then a strained, fine. Do whatever you need to, Marcus. And with that, She hung up. The emptiness in my chest felt raw and jagged, but it was better than the festering bitterness I'd carried for so long. I wasn't even angry anymore, just tired, ready to leave it all behind and rebuild something real. Over the next few days, I stayed in contact with Eve. She called to check on me, made sure I was okay, and offered to help however she could. Every time I heard her voice, the sense of calm she brought grounded me, reminded me that I wasn't truly alone. Slowly, I began to piece together a plan. I would talk to a lawyer, figure out the steps to finalize things with Rebecca, and start fresh. One night, Eve called and invited me over for dinner. I hesitated, part of me still feeling the weight of everything that had happened, but I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward her. There was something in her presence that felt like solace, like home. When I arrived at her place, she greeted me with a warm smile. Her apartment was cozy and inviting, filled with the smell of a hearty stew simmering on the stove. As she moved around the kitchen, setting the table and pouring wine, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She'd been my anchor through all of this, a reminder that there was still kindness and loyalty in the world. We talked over dinner, mostly about lighter topics, work, family, her recent travels, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a feeling that both of us knew we were skirting around something deeper. Finally, after we'd finished eating and moved to the couch with our glasses of wine, she looked at me, her eyes soft and thoughtful. "Marcus, I need to ask, what are you going to do now? About everything?" I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I'm going to file for divorce for sure. I can't keep pretending there's anything left to save with Rebecca. But beyond that, I honestly don't know." Eve nodded, her hand reaching out to cover mine. "Whatever you need, I'm here." Her words struck a chord, and without thinking, I leaned in, pressing my forehead against hers. The world seemed to fade around us, leaving only the quiet rhythm of our breaths, the unspoken promise between us. She didn't pull away, and for a long, beautiful moment, we stayed like that, savoring the comfort of each other's presence. Then, as if compelled by some invisible force, I kissed her. It was gentle at first, a soft brush of lips, but it quickly deepened, a culmination of all the feelings we'd been holding back. She tasted of wine and warmth, of something solid and real. I felt her arms wrap around me, pulling me closer, and I knew I was where I was meant to be. We spent that night together, wrapped in each other's warmth, the weight of our shared pain melting away in the quiet intimacy we found. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace, a glimmer of happiness that had been missing from my life for too long. The next morning, as we lay tangled together in the early light, I realized how much my life had changed. The anger, the resentment, the sense of betrayal, all of it seemed so small now, dwarfed by the warmth I felt lying next to Eve. She'd given me something I hadn't dared to hope for, a second chance at happiness. As I got up to leave, she reached for my hand, her fingers lacing with mine. "Marcus, I know this is all so new, but whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm here, no matter what." I nodded, unable to speak. Her words filled me with a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. I leaned down, kissing her softly, and whispered, "Thank you for everything." She smiled, squeezing my hand. "You deserve to be happy, Marcus. Don't ever forget that." Over the next few weeks, I worked with a lawyer to get the divorce process started. Rebecca didn't put up much of a fight. She seemed as eager to end things as I was, though for entirely different reasons. It was clear she wanted to keep her new life free of the complications I represented. With each passing day, I felt myself growing stronger, more certain of the path I was on. Eve remained by my side, our relationship deepening in ways I hadn't expected. She was patient, kind, understanding, never pushing me to move faster than I was ready for. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe, like I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be. But just when I thought everything was falling into place, a message arrived that sent a chill down my spine. It was from Rebecca. The message from Rebecca arrived unexpectedly, just a brief text that read, "I need to talk to you. It's important." I stared at the screen, a sinking feeling gnawing at me. Part of me wanted to ignore her completely, to erase any trace of her from my life. But another part, the part that had spent years committed to her, hesitated. What could she possibly have to say that mattered anymore? Still, curiosity got the better of me, and after a few minutes of debating, I texted back, "Fine. Meet me at the cafe on 6. I told Eve about it that night. She listened, nodding, her hand resting reassuringly on mine. "You don't owe her anything, Marcus," she reminded me gently. "But if you think this will help bring closure, I'll support you." I knew she was right. I didn't owe Rebecca an explanation or a chance to explain herself. But for some reason, I needed to hear what she had to say. The cafe was almost empty when I arrived, a quiet place filled with the smell of coffee and pastries. I found a table by the window, sipping a bitter espresso while I waited. Rebecca arrived shortly after, dressed to perfection, as if she'd put hours of thought into every detail. Seeing her again stirred something inside me, a strange mix of nostalgia and bitterness. "Marcus," she greeted me, her tone neutral but guarded. "Rebecca," I replied, keeping my voice as steady as I could. She sat down across from me, folding her hands neatly in front of her. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us speaking. Finally, she broke the silence. "I know you've moved on," she began, her voice almost a whisper. "I can see that. But I wanted to explain myself. Not for your forgiveness, but maybe so you can understand." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "All right," I said, my voice flat. "Go ahead." She took a deep breath, glancing away before looking back at me. "This isn't about excuses. I know I messed up, and I know I hurt you. But I wanted to tell you why I started seeing other people." My jaw clenched, but I forced myself to stay silent, letting her continue. "After a while, I started feeling trapped. Like I was losing myself," she confessed. "Our life felt so perfect, so structured. And I was happy, I really was. But then one day, I looked around and felt like I was fading into the background, like I didn't know who I was outside of being your wife." Her words felt hollow, but there was a rawness to her tone I hadn't expected. She took another breath, her gaze dropping to her hands. "So, yes, I started looking elsewhere. At first, it was just attention, nothing serious. But when I met Sebastian, he offered me something I felt I'd been missing. Freedom. A life that was different from everything I'd built with you." I could feel my jaw clenching tighter, but I forced myself to keep my voice even. "And you thought lying to me was the answer?" She looked up, her eyes a mixture of regret and defiance. "I know I went about it all wrong. I should have talked to you, should have told you how I was feeling. But I was afraid you wouldn't understand. You always seemed so content, so steady." I almost laughed at the irony. The steady, loyal husband who was blind to the truth. "So why tell me this now, Rebecca?" I asked, my voice cold. "Why bother with the explanation?" She hesitated, then met my gaze. "Because I need you to know it wasn't about you. This wasn't your fault. I was selfish and I hurt you, and I'll regret that forever. But I want you to know I didn't do it because of anything you did or didn't do. I just lost myself." I stared at her, trying to process everything she'd said. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to let go of the anger and resentment. But another part, one that had grown stronger over the past few months, knew I couldn't let her back in. Not after everything we'd been through. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally, my voice calm but detached. "But it doesn't change anything. We're done, Rebecca." She nodded, her face a mixture of relief and sadness. "I understand. I hope you can find happiness, Marcus. Real happiness." "I already have," I replied, standing up and signaling that the conversation was over. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange sense of closure. Rebecca's confession hadn't erased the pain, but it had put things in perspective. I could finally let go, fully and completely, of the life we'd shared. That evening, I went over to Eve's place, feeling lighter than I had in years. She welcomed me with a warm smile, her arms wrapping around me as soon as I walked through the door. I held her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against mine, the calming warmth that only she could bring. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, looking up at me with those clear, understanding eyes. Yeah, I said, nodding. I think I finally am. We spent the evening in comfortable silence, sharing small stories, laughing over silly things, and savoring the simplicity of just being together. Being with Eve felt different, effortless. There was no pretense, no secrets, just the two of us, open and vulnerable in a way I hadn't experienced in years. After a while, she looked at me, her expression thoughtful. Marcus, are you ready to move forward? She asked gently. I mean, really move forward? Her question took me by surprise, but I understood the weight behind it. She was asking if I was ready to let go of the last vestiges of my old life, to embrace a future that didn't include Rebecca or the lingering shadows of our broken marriage. I took her hand, looking into her eyes, and nodded. Yes, I am. A soft smile spread across her face, and in that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. We spent that night together, wrapped in each other's warmth, our connection deepening in ways that went beyond words. She was my anchor, my home, and I knew I wanted to build something real with her, something that couldn't be broken by lies or betrayal. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the process of starting fresh. I moved into a new apartment, a small but cozy place that felt like my own. Eve helped me settle in, bringing little touches of warmth and life into the space. A cozy throw blanket, a set of beautiful coffee mugs, small things that made the place feel like home. Rebecca and I finalized the divorce quietly. She took what she wanted, and I didn't fight her on it. I'd already moved on in every way that mattered, and I wasn't going to cling to remnants of a life that no longer felt like mine. Eve and I grew closer, our bond strengthening with every shared moment. We went on quiet weekend getaways, explored new parts of the city, spent lazy Sundays cooking together and watching movies. She became my partner in every sense of the word, filling my life with a joy I hadn't felt in years. But just when I thought I'd finally left everything behind, something happened that shattered the peace I'd worked so hard to build. It started with a phone call. I was at work when my phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen to see an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to pick up. Hello? A voice crackled through the line, one I hadn't expected to hear. It was Rebecca, her tone tense and unsteady. Marcus, I need your help. I gripped the phone tightly, my mind racing. Why was she calling me? What did she want now? What's going on, Rebecca? I asked, my voice wary. She hesitated, then spoke in a low, almost desperate tone. It's Sebastian. I think he's been following me. I don't know who else to call. Please, Marcus. I don't know what to do. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, frustration, but also a pang of concern. Despite everything, she sounded genuinely scared, and I couldn't ignore the fear in her voice. Where are you? I asked finally, my tone clipped but steady. She gave me her location, and without another word, I hung up. As much as I wanted to leave Rebecca and her mess behind, something inside me knew I couldn't ignore this. Whatever had happened between us, I couldn't turn my back on her completely. I texted Eve, letting her know what was happening. She responded immediately, her message filled with understanding and concern. Be careful, she wrote, and call me if you need anything. With a heavy heart, I headed out to find Rebecca, not knowing what I'd find, or how it might affect everything I'd finally managed to rebuild. The drive to Rebecca's location was tense, the air thick with unresolved emotions and a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. I kept replaying our last conversation, the finality of our divorce, and how much I'd moved on. Going back into her life, even for a moment, felt like opening a door I'd carefully locked. But that fear in her voice, it sounded real. She was terrified, and despite everything, I couldn't ignore it. I pulled up to the dimly lit parking lot of an old shopping center, where she said she'd be waiting. I spotted her right away, pacing nervously near her car, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if shielding herself from the world. The moment she saw me, relief washed over her face, but there was something else, something broken. She looked smaller, frilier than I remembered, as if the person I once knew had been chipped away piece by piece. Marcus, she breathed, rushing over to me. What's going on, Rebecca? I asked, my voice flat. You said Sebastian's been following you? She nodded, glancing around as if expecting him to appear out of the shadows. It started a few weeks ago, she whispered. At first, I thought it was nothing, just coincidence. But I keep seeing his car outside my building, or he'll show up at places I didn't tell him I'd be. And last night, she paused, her voice trembling. Last night, he showed up at my apartment. He was banging on the door, yelling, accusing me of seeing someone else. I felt a surge of anger. And what did you expect, Rebecca? You let this man into your life while you were married. Did you really think it would end cleanly? Her face flushed, and I could see the shame in her eyes. I know, Marcus. I know I messed up, but I didn't expect this. He's out of control. I don't know what he'll do. Despite my anger, a part of me felt sympathy for her. Whatever she'd done, she didn't deserve to be afraid in her own home. Have you reported him to the police? She shook her head. They won't take me seriously. They said he hasn't done anything illegal yet, just showing concern, as they put it. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and I could tell she felt trapped. For a moment, I struggled with my own emotions, torn between wanting to walk away and the nagging instinct to protect her. All right, I said finally. I'll stay until we figure this out. But I'm not getting sucked back into your life, Rebecca. After tonight, you're on your own. She nodded, gratitude in her eyes. Thank you, Marcus. I won't ask for anything else. We decided to go back to her apartment so she could show me the messages and calls Sebastian had left her. The drive was silent, tension filling the car as I wrestled with the reality of what was happening. I knew helping her was the right thing, but part of me resented being dragged back into her mess. When we arrived at her place, she led me into her living room, where the faint scent of lavender lingered. The apartment was minimalistic, clean, and carefully curated, almost as if she'd been trying to prove to herself that her life was still under control. I followed her to the couch, where she handed me her phone, showing me the string of increasingly hostile messages from Sebastian. Each one was worse than the last, dripping with jealousy and possessiveness. I know you're hiding something. Don't think you can ignore me. I gave up everything for you, and this is how you repay me? One message, sent late last night, made my blood run cold. You think you can just walk away? I'll make sure you regret it. I looked at Rebecca, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. For all her flaws, Rebecca had never seemed vulnerable, never appeared shaken. But now, she was like a shadow of the person I'd once known. What are you going to do? I asked, handing her phone back. She looked down, twisting her hands together. I don't know. I thought leaving you, being with him, would bring me some kind of freedom, but he's relentless. He doesn't see boundaries. And now, he won't leave me alone. Then make a police report, get a restraining order, I insisted. You're the one who let him into your life, Rebecca. It's time to do what's necessary to get him out of it. She shook her head, frustration etched on her face. You don't understand. The police don't think it's serious, and he's persuasive. He'll act calm, collected, play the victim if he has to. They won't believe me. Before I could respond, there was a loud, insistent knock at the door. Rebecca's face drained of color, and my entire body tensed. Is that? I asked, barely needing her nod to confirm what I already knew. She looked at me, panic flashing in her eyes. Please, Marcus, don't open it. Just stay quiet. Maybe he'll go away. But the knocking grew louder, more aggressive, and a voice called out, seething with anger. Rebecca, I know you're in there. Open the door. I could see the terror on her face, and something inside me shifted. Whatever resentment I felt vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct. I wasn't going to let this man bully her. I stood up, ignoring her whispered plea for me to stay quiet, and approached the door. As soon as I opened it, I saw him, Sebastian. He was tall and well-built, his expression twisted with rage and entitlement. His eyes shifted from me to Rebecca, then back, suspicion darkening his gaze. Who the hell are you? He demanded, his voice dripping with hostility. I met his glare, refusing to back down. I'm her ex-husband, and you need to leave. Now. Sebastian laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Oh, I see. She's running back to you now? Thought you could waltz in and play the hero? He leaned in, his voice a venomous hiss. Rebecca is mine. Hearing him speak about her like that set something off in me. She's not yours, Sebastian. And if you don't leave, I'll make sure the police get involved. He smirked, crossing his arms. Police? They won't do anything. Trust me, I know how the system works. But then his eyes flicked toward Rebecca, narrowing with accusation. So this is how it is, huh? You're just going to toss me aside? After everything? Sebastian, just go, Rebecca whispered, her voice shaking. It's over. You need to move on. He looked at her, his expression one of betrayal, but beneath it, there was a hint of desperation. Move on, he sneered. No, Rebecca, you don't get to just move on after what you put me through. I stepped between them, blocking his view of her. She told you to leave. If you keep harassing her, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you are. For a moment, he looked like he was going to lash out. But then, slowly, he backed up, his eyes still locked on Rebecca. Fine, but this isn't over, Rebecca. Not by a long shot. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the dimly lit hallway. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade before closing the door, feeling a wave of relief mixed with anger. This was the life she'd chosen, the man she'd left me for. And now, she was reaping the consequences. Rebecca sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I didn't think he'd get so obsessive, she murmured, her voice muffled. I stood there, feeling a strange mix of pity and frustration. You wanted freedom, Rebecca. You can't complain now that it didn't come wrapped in the pretty package you expected. She looked up, her face pale and her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I know I messed up. I thought he was different, but he's nothing like I thought he was. A part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. But another part, the part that remembered every lie, every betrayal, stayed silent. Rebecca, I'll help you this one time, I said, my voice cold and firm. But after this, you're on your own. I can't keep cleaning up your messes. She nodded, her shoulders slumping. I understand. Thank you, Marcus. I left shortly after, making it clear that this was a one-time favor. The entire drive home, my thoughts churned, conflicted. Part of me regretted getting involved, but another part felt a grim satisfaction. Sebastian had revealed his true colors, and Rebecca was finally seeing the consequences of her choices. Later that night, I called Eve, needing her calm voice to soothe the storm raging inside me. She answered almost immediately, her tone warm and gentle. How did it go? She asked softly. Worse than I expected, I admitted. He showed up while I was there. He's more dangerous than she realized. But she's seeing him for who he really is now. Eve sighed, understanding without judgment. You did the right thing, Marcus. Sometimes people have to face the consequences of their actions to really learn from them. Her words were exactly what I needed to hear, and I felt the tension slowly release. Thank you, Eve, for always being there. I'll always be here, Marcus, she replied, her voice soft but resolute. You don't have to face any of this alone. Hearing those words from her filled me with a warmth I couldn't describe. Rebecca's chaos, her choices, they were behind me now. I'd made my peace with that chapter, and now, with Eve by my side, I knew I was finally ready to start a new one. After that night with Rebecca and Sebastian's menacing threats, I focused on moving forward, mentally drawing a line around everything that had happened. My life with Rebecca felt like a faded picture I'd put away, and I was determined to keep it that way. Still, as much as I wanted to leave her behind, the memory of that encounter lingered, a reminder of how easily things could spiral out of control. Eve remained my constant, grounding me with her steady presence. She had become my sanctuary, someone I could depend on, someone who believed in my strength but knew when I needed a shoulder to lean on. We were building something real, something we both needed, and I was ready to see where it would take us. One quiet evening, we were at my apartment, laughing over a silly cooking experiment that had gone wrong. When her laughter faded, and she turned to me with a serious expression. "Marcus, I want to ask you something," she began, a hint of nervousness in her tone. I looked at her, my curiosity piqued. "Go ahead. Have you really let go of everything?" She chose her words carefully, but I knew she was referring to Rebecca and everything she had put me through. For a moment, I didn't answer. I looked down, letting her question settle over me, feeling the weight of everything I'd been through. "I think so," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "What Rebecca did to me, it cut deep, and I won't pretend I've forgotten it. But with you, it's different. I don't carry that hurt anymore, not when I'm with you." She reached out, taking my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You deserve happiness, Marcus. And if there's anything that's holding you back, I want you to tell me." I nodded, touched by her understanding, by her commitment to making our relationship one built on openness and trust. I knew I owed her that. "I've let go of Rebecca," I said firmly. "But there's one thing I can't ignore. Sebastian. I don't trust that he'll just disappear from her life, or that he won't cause trouble again." Eve's face grew serious. "Do you think he'll come after her again? Or maybe even you?" "Honestly," I replied, a chill running down my spine. "Yes. He didn't look like someone who gives up easily." Over the next few days, Eve and I talked about what to do. I didn't want to get sucked back into Rebecca's world, but if Sebastian was truly a threat, I needed to protect myself and, strangely, a part of me felt obligated to protect Rebecca as well. She may have broken my trust, but no one deserved to live in fear. I decided to take matters into my own hands, hiring a private investigator to find out more about Sebastian. Eve supported me, reminding me that this was about taking control of my life and ensuring my safety. I reached out to an old friend, Paul, who had experience in private security and investigation work. Paul and I had been close during college, and although we hadn't spoken in years, he agreed to help without hesitation. After I explained the situation, Paul assured me he'd be discreet. "I'll dig into his background, see if there's anything we can use. People like him. There's usually something they don't want others to find out." A week later, Paul called me with the information he'd uncovered. "You were right about Sebastian," he said, his tone grim. "Turns out he has a history of obsessive behavior. 2 ex-girlfriends have restraining orders against him, and one filed a harassment complaint that was dismissed because of insufficient evidence. This guy has a pattern, Marcus. He doesn't let people go easily." My stomach twisted. "So he's done this before?" "Yeah. And his last ex had to move across the country to get away from him." "It's not an isolated incident," Paul said. "This guy's a walking red flag." A mix of anger and concern washed over me. Rebecca hadn't just hurt me by being with this man. She'd walked into the arms of someone with a history of violence and obsession. I told her I was done, that I wouldn't be there to clean up her messes, but this felt bigger than either of us. Paul offered to speak with a friend of his who worked in law enforcement, hoping they could pressure Sebastian to back off. I agreed, grateful for his help, and we hung up with a plan in place. Knowing I had Paul's expertise on my side made me feel more secure, and I hoped it would be enough to keep Sebastian at bay. But just when I thought things might be settling, Rebecca reached out again. She called late one night, her voice trembling. "Marcus, I'm sorry to call you again, but I'm scared. He's been outside my building every night, just sitting in his car, watching. I don't know what to do." A wave of frustration hit me, but I pushed it aside. "Did you call the police, Rebecca?" "I did, but they said there's nothing they can do if he's just parked there. They told me to call if he tries to get in, but I can't. I can't sleep. I feel like he's watching me all the time." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I'd been ready to let her deal with this on her own, but I knew I couldn't ignore her plea for help, not when Sebastian was clearly crossing lines. "Okay, Rebecca, listen carefully," I said, my voice firm. "I've spoken to someone who knows how to handle people like Sebastian. I'm going to have them monitor the situation, but you need to stay inside, lock your doors, and don't let him know you're watching him." She breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Marcus. I know I don't deserve your help, but I don't know who else to turn to." I ended the call with a promise to keep her updated, though I felt a mix of exhaustion and dread. Every time I thought I was free of her, her life seemed to pull me back in. That weekend, Paul kept an eye on Rebecca's building. watching for any sign of Sebastian. He'd briefed his contact in the police department about Sebastian's history, and they'd agreed to increase patrols in her area. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Eve was my anchor during this time. She was patient, never once questioning my need to handle this situation, never once doubting that I'd left my old life behind. Instead, she stayed by my side, offering the quiet strength that had become my foundation. One evening, after we'd both returned from work, I told her everything, about Sebastian's exes, about his stalking, about the police's reluctance to intervene. "It sounds like he's escalating," she said, her voice laced with worry. "Are you sure he doesn't see you as, I don't know, a threat?" I hadn't thought of that, but the idea made sense. "I don't know, but I'll be careful, I promise." She nodded, her gaze serious. "Just promise me that if he comes after you, you'll go to the police. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." I reached out, pulling her into my arms, and felt the weight of her concern. She was right. I didn't have to face this on my own. And for the first time, I felt that letting someone else help didn't mean I was weak. It meant I was smart. A few days later, Paul called with an update. "We've got him, Marcus. We've got enough to file a report, but there's one problem." My heart pounded. "What is it?" "Sebastian's been looking into you. I don't know how he found out, but he knows you're involved. And I'd bet he's not happy about it." A cold chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean? He's been looking into me." "Nothing extreme, just gathering info, asking people around town. He knows you're the one who confronted him that night. And from what I hear, he's not a guy who likes being crossed." My pulse quickened, the reality of the situation sinking in. I'd assumed this was Rebecca's problem, that she brought this mess into her life. But now it was clear. Sebastian saw me as an obstacle. And obstacles, to people like him, had to be removed. Paul's voice softened. "Look, Marcus, you need to be careful. He's unpredictable. Just watch your back, okay?" I thanked Paul, ending the call, but I couldn't shake the tension that settled over me. This was more serious than I'd realized. I'd wanted to help Rebecca, to ensure her safety, but now I was in Sebastian's sights too. I decided to tell Eve that night, not wanting to hide anything from her. When I finished explaining, her face went pale, her hand tightening around mine. "Marcus, this is dangerous," she whispered, fear evident in her eyes. "What if he comes after you? What if he tries to—" "I know," I interrupted gently, "but we'll be careful. Paul's watching him, and the police are aware of the situation now. I wanted you to know what's happening." She nodded, her expression resolute. "Whatever happens, I'm with you. We'll face it together." I pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her embrace, the strength in her presence. She was my light, my reason for pushing forward. With Eve by my side, I knew I could face whatever came our way. But a nagging feeling lingered, a reminder that Sebastian wasn't the kind of man to back down easily. As I lay awake that night, holding Eve close, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Sebastian wasn't going to disappear quietly, and now that he knew I was involved, the stakes had only risen. The next week was tense, the uncertainty gnawing at me with every passing day. Paul kept me updated on Sebastian's movements, but the man was elusive, slipping in and out of view like a ghost. He hadn't shown up outside Rebecca's building again, but there were signs he was still watching. Paul suspected Sebastian had caught onto the surveillance and was waiting, biding his time for the right moment. I tried to put him out of my mind, to focus on Eve and the life we were building together, but it felt like a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon. And then, one evening, the storm finally broke. It was late, well past midnight. Eve and I were asleep when a loud, insistent banging shattered the quiet. My heart leapt as I jolted awake, adrenaline surging through me. Eve sat up beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," I whispered, grabbing my phone and moving toward the door. The pounding continued, relentless and angry. I peered through the peephole, and there he was, Sebastian. His face was twisted with rage, his fists slamming against the door. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. There was no running from this confrontation now. I opened the door a crack, just enough to face him. "What the hell do you want, Sebastian?" He sneered, his eyes flashing with something dark and unhinged. You thought you could interfere, huh? Thought you could just swoop in and protect her from me? His voice was slurred, his words laced with barely controlled anger. Rebecca doesn't want anything to do with you, Sebastian. It's over. Just leave her alone. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed in the hallway. She doesn't get to decide that, and neither do you. She's mine. You think you can just take over my life? Act like some kind of hero? Go home, Sebastian, I said firmly. If you don't, I'll call the police. But he took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. Call them. Go ahead. I'll still be here when they leave. You think I don't know how to play the game? As I considered my next move, Eve appeared in the hallway behind me. Marcus, who is it? Her voice was soft, but the worry in it cut through the tension like a knife. Sebastian's gaze shifted to her, and his face twisted with a new, ugly fury. Oh, I get it now, he snarled. You think you've won, don't you? You've replaced Rebecca, found yourself a new little prize. You're just as pathetic as she said. I took a step in front of Eve, blocking her from his view. Get out of here. Now, this is your last warning. But Sebastian was beyond reason. In a flash, he lunged forward, grabbing my shirt, his breath hot and rancid in my face. I shoved him back with all my strength, and he staggered, fury blazing in his eyes. Fine, he spat. You want to play the hero? Let's see how far you're willing to go. He stormed down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he disappeared into the night. I stood there, heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. Eve came up beside me, her face pale, her hand reaching for mine. Marcus, are you okay? She whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, pulling her into my arms, feeling the tremor in her body as I held her close. I'm fine, but this isn't over. He's not going to give up easily. The next day, I called Paul and filled him in on what had happened. He didn't mince words. Marcus, this guy's dangerous. He's unpredictable. If he's willing to show up at your place, he's capable of a lot more. I can work with the police to get an emergency restraining order, but that's a piece of paper. You need to be ready to protect yourself. I felt a wave of grim determination wash over me. Do whatever you need to, Paul. I'm not letting him scare us. Over the next few days, Eve and I were vigilant, staying alert, keeping to ourselves. But there was no sign of Sebastian. It was as if he'd vanished. Part of me hoped he'd finally taken the hint, but another part knew he was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, a week later, just when I thought he'd given up, I got a call. It was Rebecca. Marcus, she gasped, her voice frantic. He broke into my apartment. I came home and found everything trashed. I think he's gone, but I'm scared. I don't know what to do. My heart sank. Are you safe now? Yes. I went to a friend's place. But Marcus, he left a note. It was about you. He said this isn't over until he makes you pay. I hung up, my mind racing. Sebastian wasn't just obsessed with Rebecca. He saw me as the obstacle to his twisted fantasy. He wanted control, and as long as I was in the picture, he would never stop. I called Paul again, explaining the situation. I don't think he's after Rebecca anymore. I told him, my voice tense. He's fixated on me. Paul was silent for a moment, then he spoke, his tone deadly serious. Then we need to end this, Marcus. Tonight. Paul arranged for a team of security professionals to keep watch outside my apartment, hoping to catch Sebastian if he tried anything. Eve insisted on staying with me, refusing to leave me alone despite my attempts to convince her otherwise. She held my hand, her strength steadying me as the night wore on. It was just after midnight when the first sign of trouble appeared. One of Paul's men radioed in, alerting us that they'd seen someone lurking in the shadows across the street. I glanced at Eve, her eyes wide but resolute, and nodded. This was it. Moments later, there was a soft knock on the door. I stepped forward, taking a deep breath, and opened it. Sebastian stood there, his face contorted with a twisted smile, a smug satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. Marcus, he drawled, his voice mocking. Long time no see. I held my ground, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. It's over, Sebastian. Leave, before you make things worse for yourself. But he just laughed. Over? This is only the beginning. You don't get to steal what's mine and walk away unscathed. As he stepped forward, the security team moved in, restraining him, and Paul appeared, his face hard with resolve. Sebastian struggled against their grip, his rage spilling over. You think you can get rid of me? I'll find a way. This isn't over, Marcus. I'll make sure you pay for this. But as he was dragged away, I felt a weight lift. For the first time, I knew he was gone for good, his threats nothing but empty words. The police arrived shortly after, taking him into custody, and I watched as he disappeared into the back of a patrol car, the tension that had haunted me finally dissolving. Eve came up beside me, wrapping her arms around me. It's over, Marcus, she whispered, her voice filled with relief. I held her close, feeling the strength of her embrace, the warmth of her love. Yes, I replied softly. It's over. In the weeks that followed, life gradually returned to normal. Rebecca and I finalized the last details of our divorce, and she reached out one last time. A message of gratitude for my help, but a quiet acceptance that our paths had diverged for good. I felt a strange sense of peace, knowing we were both finally free to move forward. Eve and I took things slowly, savoring the quiet moments, rebuilding the life we both yearned for, one rooted in honesty, trust, and shared strength. With her by my side, I knew I'd found something deeper than anything I'd ever known. She wasn't just a partner. She was my sanctuary, my home. One evening, as we sat together watching the sunset from my balcony, she turned to me, a soft smile playing on her lips. Marcus, she murmured, I want to thank you for letting me be part of this journey, for trusting me. I took her hand, my heart full. Thank you, Eve, for being my light, for showing me that real love is something. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I leaned over and kissed her, feeling the peace I'd fought so hard to find finally settle over me. The darkness that had once clouded my life was gone, replaced by a love that was steady, unwavering, and true. And with Eve, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it. Together. Oh my God, another really good one. I really hope you enjoyed this Reddit story video. I had a great time reading this. If you want more of this kind of content, just leave a comment, let me know. Follow my channel. I'm really trying to hit 1,000 subs before the end of the year. And we can do it. It's going to happen, guys. Thank you so much. Now, everybody have a great night and have a sweet dreams.